Can you believe it? It's already our last class. So, welcome to week 7. So, in the immortal words of Canadian pop sensation Shania Twain, looks like we've made it. Look how far we've come. So, something that I thought would be really helpful for this week was, because you've already submitted your major assignment, to actually just do a recap of what I think is the most important parts of this course that I want you to take away um, with you now that we're done. So I'm going to go through actually every lecture, and I've pulled out some of the main tenets of things that I want you to keep in mind as you go forward into the world of community management. So let's go back over the last 7 weeks and see what we've actually learned about community management. I think the biggest thing that I want you to take away is the reminder that community equals people. And so if we go back to the first week, you'll remember that we talked about a community manager having 3 jobs. So acting as a brand and community evangelist, advocating, and building that community. And importantly, we talked about these 6 qualities: that a community manager needs to be knowledgeable, they need to be a listener, they need to be responsive, they need to be proactive, empathetic, and a decent human being. And so again, this is the idea of creating a community and creating a space where people are going to feel listened to. And you'll remember that throughout the course, we've talked a lot about communication being a two-way street. And this is really the defining principle for community management. And I think we've seen a number of times throughout the course where these 6 qualities come into place and where we value them in our own interaction with brands and with the communities that we follow. So we have agreed that we think it's important to feel like you're being listened to be responded to in a timely manner, and to be treated like a decent human being when you're encountering a frustrating situation. And I think when you are out in the world as community managers, if you're able to really live by that principle of like treating people in your community the way that you want to be treated, you're going to get pretty far. So in class 2, we looked at a number of theoretical elements to community management, and one of those things was looking at the 5 dimensions of relationships. So if you remember, we talked about these things just sort of looking at them as a foundation for how community management needs to work. So the idea of committing to your community, to understanding that you can't control everything once you've put it out there, and that's that control mutuality idea. The idea of communality, so again, like what is bringing us all together. Having trust, so making sure that people trust you to listen to them, to provide them with a service, to give them real information, to engage them. All of these things are trust. And then at the end of the day, in community management, people need to be satisfied. So if they're not satisfied with what they're getting from your community, they're going to leave. And that's another thing that we can sort of control through making sure that we really understand who our community is, but sometimes we can't. And I think all 5 of these things really work together when we're trying to build a strong community. So something that we talked about in relation, to building a community is this idea of, dialogue. So here is an overview again of like what these basic principles are for building a dialogue online. So you may remember that this was actually formulated kind of in the early days of regular internet use. So looking at how to keep people on websites and how to get them to engage with websites. But you probably also remember us figuring out how these things can work in a context for social. So, we talked about the importance of having useful information on websites, making sure that you have frequent updates so that you're generating new content, making sites easy to use and navigate, and striving to, keep the public on your site. So again, having eyeballs on there for longer periods of time, digesting all of the content that you're putting out there, that's a really great way to build dialogue online. But then we looked at applying these to social. So, making sure that our content is useful to our community and it's useful for the platform that we're putting out there. We said that we wanted to publish updates really often because new content and responses from your community are going to help build that dialogue. We wanted to make sure that information is easy to find for our community, so making sure that our bios are filled out, that we have links to our website, and trying other things other than just posting content to keep your community engaged. So things like Twitter chats and building specific groups and having events online and in person, all of those things help build a dialogue with your community. So again, what we really want to be taking away from this is the idea that communication is a two-way street, and we need to foster our communities in a way that makes sense for them, in a way that responds to the things that they're looking for. And we can't take our community for granted. So I think it's all well and good to have a community and just expect that people who like your product or like your service are going to engage for you, but it's not enough. It's not a one-way street. So you've got to be giving them something that they feel is useful, and you want to be getting something back. Maybe that's in the form of feedback or engagement, but keep that in mind as you grow your communities. So something that I'm hoping you all remember is this honeycomb. So you may remember us talking about a study that came out of Vancouver's SFU in about 2011, and what that study did was it looked at how social media strategy for companies can work, and just sort of understanding like what the functionality is of social media, and on the flip side of that, what the implications of that functionality is. So there's seven things. So looking at your identity, which is the extent to which users reveal themselves online. You have groups, which is the extent to which users are ordered or formed communities. Conversation, so how users communicate with each other. Sharing, how users are exchanging, distributing, and receiving their content. Presence, so you know understanding if others are available and if people are around for them. Relationships, so again, like how people on social media relate to each other. And lastly, reputation, so the extent to which users know the social standing of others and their content. And kind of then looking at the flip side of those things. So, if you have a group, so looking at like how groups are ordered or formed. The flip side of that implication is understanding membership rules and protocol. So you may remember from this lecture really digging into what all of these things mean. We talked about data privacy, we talked about content management systems, we talked about how to create and manage reality and intimacy and immediacy in the context of social media. We talked about how to flow the network of relationships, all of these things. But I think at the end of the day, if you can understand that building an online community and using social media comes down to these seven things, and you can keep these seven things in mind, you're going to do great. And obviously, all of the things in here tie really well into understanding how to put together a content calendar, understanding your brand voice, understanding your personas. All of these things, they go together. The general rule here is that social media communities that don't value identity also don't highly value relationships. So a thing that you need to ask yourself kind of before you get started is, are you managing existing relationships, or are you building new ones? Or are you doing both? So once you know the answer to that, you're actually able to sort of take these things that we've been talking about and put them into practice. So understanding kind of like who your community is, what kind of relationships you have with them, that is what builds your identity. And that's like what you need to figure out before you can start hiring community managers and start making a bunch of content. Once you have that, you're able to filter your strategy and your content and your interactions and all of your information through those lenses, whether it's a new relationship, an existing relationship, or both. You may remember from this lecture, this is where we started talking about the idea of strong and weak ties. So people who don't really engage with your brand but know who you are, and also your brand evangelists. And so we've started thinking about how we're going to create content and serve both of these types of people that exist in our communities. And again, that is something that you're going to want to keep in mind as you go forward, to always be nurturing all of the groups and all of the links within your community. One of the things that I asked you to do for your major assignment was to develop a brand voice. And part of why we do that is because it helps us understand the identity that we're trying to present to the world through our brand. So figuring out who our character is, what our persona is like, our tone, our language, our purpose, all of these things help build the identity of the brand that we're managing. So if we're playful, if we're friendly, if we're honest, if we're clinical, if we're complex, if we're engaging or educational or informative or serious, fun, all of these things give a different experience to people interacting with your brand online. And as you know, throughout the course, we talked a lot about how to reconcile your brand goals with what you're actually putting out there. So again, like all of these things build together to really help you understand what your identity is, what you sound like, who you sound like that to, and how you're able to continue to create content and engage people by using that brand identity. And of course, the next step of that, which I also asked you to look at in your major assignment, is understanding who your marketing personas are. So it's not just enough to split people up into, weak and strong links, to only make content for new customers, but to understand, what kind of relationships am I fostering and who are those people? What are their goals? What are their challenges? What are their values? And what am I saying that's going to really resonate with them? What's my elevator pitch? And part of why I asked you to do 3 to 5 of these is because no matter what you're selling, even if it's one product, it is a bit more multidimensional than it may seem on the surface. And I think that this can be a thing that is hard for people to understand when they're first starting in community management. But I think remembering that your community is made up of a lot of different people, they have maybe different goals when they're interacting with you. They might have different reasons for buying your services or buying your products. And the best way to understand that is to do some personas, get some research to back it up, and again, make sure all of that fits with your brand goals and your brand identity. When we started this whole process of trying to understand why we're building communities and what their identities are, we looked at these 8 steps. And I still think that this is your go-to when you're trying to understand how to build a community, or even if you're doing, a reassessment of like what you're doing and you want to see if it's working well and if it's resonating in the way that you want it to. So you'll remember we've talked a lot about this idea of always in beta. So these 8 steps can be helpful whether you are launching something for the first time or you are, reevaluating. Go back to these. So let's review these 8 steps. You can't do anything without knowing what your business objective is. It's the foundation of everything you do, and as you can see, it helps you build through these 8 steps. You need to identify what your community will be about, how you're going to talk to them, and how you're going to talk to them about the things that they care about on the platforms that they use. Then you need to build a strategy and figure out who's doing what, and once that's ready, you can start analyzing and reporting on that data so that you can make changes if you need to. Again, like if you need to pivot, you change your strategy, and that's okay. A strategy for 100 people looks a lot different than a strategy for 10,000. So that's part of why we want to use this as a guiding principle for always being in beta as well. Remember this quote, content is king, but context is God. I think that's, again, something that I want to leave you with because like I said, if you are just out there creating content and you don't know who your audience is and you don't really know what you're trying to achieve, you don't have any context. And really, in order to make your content work, you've got to have context. You have to know who's looking at it, why they're looking at it, and what you're trying to get out of it. And so I will remind you that strategy before content is the most important thing. And while we're talking about content, let's also look at this graph again. So understanding where our content fits, and again, understanding what your brand goals are, what you're trying to achieve, and seeing, are you creating content that's helping people do one of these things? In the final assignment, you had to make a content calendar, and I think it's helpful to know what that content is trying to do for you. So remember we talked about if you are a new brand or you're launching a new product, a lot of your content is going to fall into that awareness category. So just trying to get people's eyeballs onto your page. And from that, you'll become a bit more specific and detailed, and that's where we hit the trigger stage. So you'll remember that the purpose of this funnel is like we're starting with a lot of people, and the idea is that we're narrowing through to get more people to buy and stay, and that's our conversion rate. And so, even though that looks differently if you're a not for profit or a charity, or you're selling a product or a service, these are still the steps. So after you've made a name for yourself and people are coming to your website, you're kind of giving them a bit more specific and detailed information, and that's where they start searching for more information about that specific thing. And as they're searching, they are considering. They're considering products. They're maybe doing this on a couple of other sites, which again is why competitor analysis is really important. But once they're in the consideration stage, it's pretty likely that you can flip them from considering to buying. And so once you've got someone in that funnel and they are thinking about your product or thinking about your service, it's not enough to just get them to buy the product or subscribe to the newsletter or whatever action it is that you're trying to get them to do. You want them to stay. And by getting people to stay, that's how you create those brand evangelists. That's how you create people who kind of put your message out there for you. And so I think this funnel is super important regardless of what kind of business you are. And again, it just goes back to this idea of needing to understand what it is that you're trying to accomplish with your brand. So you may remember that in this funnel, there's also different content types that you may be using depending on your business and depending on your business goals. So you may have created content, licensed content, curated content, user-generated content. And again, there's really no right or wrong in how much of whichever you're using. It really just goes back to like you need to understand your brand, you need to understand your community. And I am hoping that through all of this, you've been able to see why I presented things in the steps that I did, because everything builds off of each other. And, like I've said, you can't have your content before your strategy. Your content goes back to your strategy. Everything is interlinked. And so, even understanding, like, is your community the kind that would enjoy user created content or not? That's important for you to know before you even get to the content creation stage. Remember me? The two things that we always need to remember with creating content is our content relevant? Is it valuable? Is it going to help us with our brand goals? Does it mesh with our brand identity? Does it mesh with our community? And I think anytime that you're curious about a piece of content that you're creating, just go back to these two things, if nothing else, and it'll help you decide if you should be using it or not. And one of the big things that we talked about with content was ensuring that you understood the other parts of marketing communication that might be happening for your brand. So making sure that community management and social media isn't in a silo. And I love this illustration because the idea of death by silo is so important. And I know for me, like if my sales team isn't talking to my marketing team, isn't talking to my IT team, we're not getting anything done. And if we are, we're not doing it as well as we could. And I'm sure it feels sometimes like there's just too many things to wrap our head around when we're doing community management. But I think that's why it's so important to come up with your strategy before you do anything. Because you'll understand like how public relations and email marketing and SEO and real life events and landing pages and how all of those things work together and how you can support those efforts and how those efforts can support you. So even if you are a department of one person, just understand what everything is that's going out into the world from your brand, because it's really not ever just community management. It is a larger narrative, it's a larger sales or marketing campaign. It's bigger than just you, and working with a team and not being siloed is an amazing way to make sure you get all of the things done that you want to get done. And when we think about those things that we want to get done, it's really important, again, to know what our goals are for our content before we start measuring them and before we start looking at metrics. And so even though, reporting and analytics can look different for everyone. I think these 5 things are really important to keep in mind. And I hope that as you go forward, whether it's implementing the content calendar that you made for this project or something that you're going to do in the future, just don't let yourself get overwhelmed by the numbers and don't get lost in the weeds. I feel like that's really, really easy. It's especially easy if you have a boss who doesn't really understand what they're asking you to look at. But know what you're trying to achieve, and that immediately makes analytics a lot easier. Finally, I know we just talked about this last week, but this idea of, you know, response management and crisis communications, I think that this is such an interesting topic, and I would love to hear some more thoughts in the group this week, just about ways that you've maybe encountered this kind of crisis communication and just things that you've really learned from watching other people go through it, um, what you would do. And I think that these 5 things are really good guiding principles. And part of why I feel that way is because it's just things that have come up so many times throughout this course. Listening, responding, learning, always being in beta, not losing your cool, and really just having control over the information that you're putting out there. All of those things help you when you're dealing with, a troll or you're dealing with a product recall. And those are things that you're going to run into. And it's just going to be in varying degrees. Maybe you're lucky and it's just somebody leaving a nasty comment, but maybe you work for a food company and you've got to deal with listeria. But losing your cool is never going to help. And I think always going back to this idea of community are people, and you need to listen to them, you need to respond to them, and you need to make them feel like you give a damn. And so, even though these overall guiding principles that we looked at last week, are kind of specific for crisis communications, I do actually think that they're helpful overall when you're a community manager. Being compassionate, being informative, not giving in to people who are behaving poorly in your community or who are giving you a super hard time, and also double checking that the information you post is correct. The number of times that a news organization just misidentifies someone is pretty horrific. I will put some examples in the group this week. And just overall, like, you can avoid a lot of issues that might come up in communication with your client base or with your consumer base just by being informative and by kind of employing a cover your ass policy. And I say that because it's like if you reduce how many mistakes you could make and how many variables might get messed up on your end, it makes it a lot less likely that something is going to happen once you've put it out there in the world. And I will go back to that idea of once you've put something out there, it's no longer in your control. So if you are a news organization and you misidentify a person, it's already out there. It doesn't matter if you take it down because somebody's probably taken a screenshot of it. So all you can do is kind of go from there and figure out what you're going to do. And last but not least, let's go back to the how. How does community management work? How are we going to do it? Obviously, number 1, we're going to listen. 2, we're going to cultivate our brand lovers. We're going to get them on board to help us do some of our work for us. We're going to get them to tell our stories, to share our content, to engage people. We're going to get them to help us tell our story through user-generated content. 3, we're going to remember that community management is two-way communication. So you need to be listening, you need to be responding, and you need to be putting things out there that let your community talk back to you. So if that's a survey or a feedback form, or a focus group or a real life event, you've got to give them something because they give you a lot. And this idea of everybody getting something out of it, you'll remember from our first assignment looking at the contest, right? So it's all well and good to have a contest, but are you getting anything out of it? And are they getting something out of it that will make them want to participate? Last but certainly not least, appreciate. Appreciate your community, appreciate your weak links, your strong links, appreciate your teams that you work with. make sure that you appreciate at every level, and make sure you can talk about that appreciation. If you've got a rewards program, or if you've got contests that you've run, or you have a feedback form, make sure that you're acknowledging when you get that engagement, when you get those responses, because all of those things that people say to you and all of the things that you hear from being a community manager, just take it back to that always in beta approach. Because appreciating the things that your community tells you, even if they're not 100% positive, is just going to make you a more, attentive brand. It's going to help you better understand who your community is, and it's going to make you a better community manager. And so, on that note, I'm also always in beta, and so is this class. One of the things that I've put in this week's lecture is actually a survey because I want feedback from you. I want to know if you liked these lectures, if you thought they were long enough, what your favorite one was, how you liked the homework, if you thought there were too many readings, and just to help me identify some gaps in knowledge that you maybe wish that we had covered or that you thought I did really well. And I'm hoping that with that feedback, I can go back to you in the Facebook group and say, hey, thanks. This is how I'm going to change these things. Because again, I want to appreciate you and I want to appreciate the time that you're taking to fill out that survey for me. And that's it. This is the end of the class. You've done it. You're now ready to go off into the world of community management. You've built a killer plan. You understand all of these things. And what I've seen in our Facebook group over the last 7 weeks is that you really understand what it takes to, be loyal to a brand and also to see what they do that makes you like them. And so I want you to keep that in mind the rest of this week, because this is actually your last chance to get those participation marks up. I'm in the middle of marking your final assignments, and so get things in that Facebook group if you haven't already. Ask questions. If you have examples, if you want to kind of riff on anything that I've talked about in this video or throughout the class, I would love to, have a thread that's like what you took away from this class. And let's see if everybody agrees with those things. Let's see what they've learned. So thanks for learning together. Have a great rest of your week.